Okay, tonight we're going to talk about obstruction and catcher's interference. Pretty interesting plays. You know, for the past couple of weeks we've been talking about interference, whether it was the batter runner, runner. Those were kinds of violations that were against the offense. Now we're talking about a violation against the defense. So here we are in our schedule. Thanks for hanging in there. We're at our fifth review, so we're about halfway through our program for this year. And let's go ahead. As Norm indicated, it's Tim, myself, and Norm, along with Jerry, and I do believe we also have John Porter, who is sitting in tonight as well. Here's our agenda for tonight. As we always, we'll start off with clarifications, then we'll get into obstruction. I have a number of charts that will do an overview of obstruction, and then we'll do a deeper dive talking about obstruction where we have the infractions by the fielder or the catcher, and that's going to be on the runner. Then we're going to talk about infractions by the catcher, and that's going to be on the batter, and that's catcher's interference. And then, as always, we sprinkle a little Q&A time for you guys to ask a number of questions. No clarifications from our last review, but there was one thing I did want to add when we were talking about an interfering umpire. Most of the stuff that we presented last week had to do with the physical actions of our interfering umpire. Well, it goes actually beyond physical contact. It can also be the result of us inaccurately providing information to either teams. And I have a couple examples here where we have an inadvertent infield fly ball call or no call, where it is an infield fly situation and we don't call it, or it's not an infield fly situation and we do call it. You know, so that is now something that we try to avoid, but it does happen. We umpires may also inadvertently give a coach or a player some wrong information that might be related to outs, the number of outs, or the ball strike count. And the two examples that I show below is we have 2 outs when actually there's only 1, and the runner on first advances, and we have a fly ball, and now they tag that runner up, and there's no recourse, you know, in providing that, in trying to rectify that situation. And then the other example is we have 1 strike when actually there's 2. We have a drop third strike situation, and the batter does not attempt to advance to first because we told them there was only 1 strike, and now he's called out. So ultimately, it's the player and the coach's responsibility for knowing the game situation, even though we may erroneously provide information to either teams. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. We try to avoid that as much as possible. But the bottom line is the play is going to stand even with the result of the inadvertent or inaccurate information that we have passed on to the teams. Another thing I wanted to mention is for those of you out on the Federation website, the rule interpretations for 2020 is out, so it's now available to you. And this is that page on the Federation website. And if you take a look, we've had a number of conversations on the DH rule changes for this year. They've added some case plays in the interpretations that they've released. So I recommend that all of you guys go out and take a look at that. And oh, by the way, I'm not going to go back to the schedule. We have added an additional review on the DH. We've done it once before. We're going to go back and take a look at that again a second time. And that's going to be on the last session, which would be the 16th of March. And there's that announcement. So we're going to look at that DH rule again one more time in review 10 on 16 March. Okay, so now let's go ahead and turn to our topic for tonight, which is obstruction. So the next 4, 5, or 6 charts is going to be a high-level overview, followed by a more detailed review of each of the obstruction that's in the rule book. So what is obstruction? We have obstruction that's going to be by on a runner, or we're going to have an obstruction where we obstruct, the defense obstructs the catcher, and that's going to be catcher's interference. So when we have a situation where there's obstruction on a runner, it's going to be by a fielder, whether that runner is advancing or returning, or it's going to be by the catcher, and those are going to be plays at the plate. That's not catcher interference. Those are plays that are taking place at the plate that involve a catcher. For catcher's interference, it's going to be on the batter, and again, it's going to be by the catcher, and usually that's going to be when the batter makes an attempt to hit at the pitched ball. So let's go through the next several charts and take a look at the rule set that's out there. Again, obstruction is an act, whether if it's intentional or unintentional, we don't care. And that's going to be by the defense, where the defense is hindering a runner or changes the pattern of play. Or as we just saw, by the catcher, generally, usually, normally, most of the time by the catcher when they hinder the batter. In all obstruction cases, the ball is going to become dead at the end of playing action, so it's going to be a delayed dead ball. And then the umpire has the authority to determine how many bases the batter or batter runner should be awarded as a result of the obstruction. In the rule book, it also talks about a fake tag that is classified as obstruction. We don't see that too much, but it's there, and for completeness purposes, we added it here. So that is considered obstruction as well. And another component of obstruction is a fielder without possession of the ball, where he's denying access to the base for either an advancing or a returning runner. And we have a number of charts that we'll look at that talks about that. A little bit more for Rule 222, we're talking about a fielder who hinders a runner. So we have a couple of examples here: runners who are advancing or runners who are returning. We'll see in a minute an example where there's no contact, but yet we have obstruction because the obstruction caused a change in the pattern of play for one of our base runners. Here are some examples of catcher's interference. We have a couple of videos that we'll show in a little bit, where the catcher hinders the batter's attempt to swing at a pitch. Or a fielder without possession denies access to a base in which a runner is attempting to achieve. And that could be on a back pick, that could be on an advancing runner, on a steal, or generally, usually, normally, most of the time when it involves a catcher, it's going to be plays at the plate. So we have a couple of videos that we'll take a look at that will cover a lot of these examples. For completeness purposes, again, the fake tag is in there. But the big takeaway for this chart, chart 16, on obstruction, these are going to be a delayed dead ball situation. So we're going to allow the play to continue until all playing action has ceased. When we get into the rules that are related to the runner, we're now talking about when a catcher or any defensive player obstructs the runner. Or when the catcher obstructs a batter's attempt to swing at a pitch. This is one of three situations where the coach actually gets the opportunity to take the penalty or the result of the play. But in doing so, we as umpires will call the obstruction, but it's not our obligation, it's not our responsibility to tell the coach that he has an option. So the default for us as umpires is to call the obstruction, and it is up to the coach to determine whether or not he has an opportunity to take, again, the result of the play or the penalty. There's a sunset clause. When they do that, they have to do that either at the time of the next pitch or before a base award or before infielders leave the diamond. It's ignored. The obstruction is ignored if a batter runner reaches first and all other runners who are on base advance at least one base. So we can either enforce the obstruction if runners do not advance one base, or we can ignore it if they do advance, the batter runner and all runners advance one base. Another component to obstruction is when there's a runner who's attempting to advance on catcher's obstruction, catcher's interference, that batter who's stealing is going to be awarded the base that he is attempting. If a runner is not attempting to advance on catcher's interference, then we are not going to award that runner that next subsequent base. And obstruction is enforced. Again, all runners on the play will return to the occupied base at the time of the pitch. The batter is going to be awarded first base if he didn't reach first base. If obstruction is not enforced, all runners advance at their own risk. So I know there's a lot here, so we'll continue to try and break it down. Again, runners when advancing or returning to a base, runners are going to be awarded a minimum of one base. They may be awarded more if, in our judgment, the obstruction prevented or denied runners the opportunity to advance to multiple bases. But at a minimum, they will be awarded one base. I threw this in here because I want to let everyone know that during a play in which you might see obstruction, and if you also experienced malicious contact, the malicious contact will always supersede the obstruction call. We may not see a lot of that, but again, for completeness purposes, we wanted to include this in the presentation for tonight. And another component to obstruction is if a runner passes an unobstructed preceding runner, that runner is going to be ruled out. But if that lead runner is obstructed and the following runner advances beyond that runner, then we're going to ignore the passing of the runner because the lead runner was obstructed. When obstruction occurs, the ball becomes dead at the end of the playing action. We want to allow the play to continue with the exception of malicious contact. There are three potential rulings. There's going to be a prescribed base award, which is the minimum of one base. The umpire will have the authority to determine base or bases to negate the obstruction. We may have no base award because we have the batter runner and all runners advancing one base. And if runners advance at least one base or the coach elects to make the result of the play, again, the delayed dead ball allowed runners to advance. You also have to remember that the obstruction only offers a limited amount of protection to the base that that runner would have advanced to in the absence of obstruction. Beyond that, runners will have to advance at their own risk. So that's a pretty quick overview, 40,000-foot overview of obstruction. Before I move on, I'd like to go ahead and see if Norm, Tim, Jerry have any comments or any questions are out there. Then we're going to go ahead and break this down just a little bit further.
Greg, there aren't any questions just yet, but I'm assuming there might be as we continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I know that first segment was a little fast just to hopefully get us back on track, so I'll try and slow it down, and we'll go through each of the other components of obstruction. So we'll talk about obstruction by a fielder on a runner. Again, here's our rule. Runners are going to be awarded a minimum of one base, and there is an opportunity for additional bases to be awarded to nullify the obstruction call. So our first look at obstruction by a fielder is when they are blocking a base to which a runner is advancing. So here you can see we have a runner stealing second into third, catcher throwing the ball down. The fielder does not have possession of the ball, and as you can see, he is completely blocking the base. So this would be a pretty clear obstruction call. It wouldn't be obstruction if this fielder had given some access to our base at third base, either in our situation A, where he's given complete access, or in our scenario B, where he's giving partial access. So if he were to do that, he would be legal. But as you can see in our play, he's not. It's completely blocking the third base. He's not in possession of the ball. So we have a good obstruction call on this play. And we would award that runner who's stealing, which in this case would be R2, we'd award him the minimum of one base, which would be third base. Here we have an example of a runner who tried to stretch it into a double and decided not to do that and was returning back to first base. And as you can see, our fielder, our first baseman, F3, is not in possession of the ball. Our runner's attempting to return back to first base when the obstruction by F3 occurs. So a little mechanic thing here. Our runner was trying to stretch a single into double, decided to turn back, go back into first base. So for us, we're either going to be in one of multiple positions on any runners returning into first base. The red U1 is if we had a runner on first, and he's diving back in, let's say on a pickoff. We have an obstruction there. In our white U1, this is where we come in from the A position. We do our pivot. The runner stops, decides not to advance a second, comes back into first. So we're going to be kind of generally in that area on that base return. And again, we're going to award the runner a minimum of one base. Again, other examples where we're denying access without possession of the ball. We have the back pick, you can see here, and we saw already our steal play. So let's go ahead and show our first clip.
Whether it's a pickoff attempt, a scoring play at the plate, a cutoff and subsequent throw interpretation of active fielding, the fielder would have to be within a step and reach in a direct attempt.
Back. Okay, so again, we just showed you a couple video clips where the fielder was without possession and was blocking the base and is in jeopardy of an obstruction call. So you saw in clip 1, that was on the back pick. Clip 2 was a runner stealing second, and clip 3 was also a runner stealing second. From a mechanics perspective, because we have a runner on first base, U1 is going to be on the inside, so that's the kind of look that we're going to see on a play, on a back pick for trying to pick off a runner at first. Mechanically, for us, again, U1 with a runner on first on a steal play, and we have the blocking plays that we saw in clip 2 and 3. We're going to see that from our position inside the diamond, which we should be able to get a pretty good look at. So I thought I'd throw in what we think we would look at from where we are on these types of plays. So we go from obstruction where we're blocking the base or the plate to where we're actually hindering or impeding a runner. So here you can see we have a couple examples where our first baseman is obstructing our batter runner who's rounding first. There's no contact, but he has altered the pattern of the play. In our second clip, which we'll show you, we have a runner who's rounding second and interferes or is obstructed by the shortstop. We have a couple examples where we have obstruction being called in a rundown situation where it can happen. And then we have one of the more interesting plays in the World Series from a number of years ago where we had the obstruction call at third base. And then we'll show a follow-up with our last clip with we have multiple fielders who are fielding, and we have contact with our batter runner who's attempting to try and reach first base. So let's go ahead and take a look at those.
Start for the Yankees, maybe. Not a good start. Goodbye.
Knobloch taking a fruitful chance. A great play by Jay Payton. But Zeal makes him.
With Ahmed, there's where he's deked. He doesn't know where the ball is. They fake the double play. Touch second, he runs into Ahmed. Obstruction.
They had Victorino on the rundown.
And Victorino comes back and runs into Delgado. Reyes, I'm sorry. See, he runs back into Reyes.
Jay grounds one. Pedroia makes the play. Throw home. 2 out. Over to third. It gets away. Alan Craig
Going to third, so the first man is out. The throw is wide, and now Middlebrooks can't get out of the way. Obstruction is.
They're running back toward first base. Torrey trying to make some defensive back moves, and he's finally out. He must have thought he was Torrey Jr. right there. Oh, now look at it. Watch Adam Dunn here. Torrey ran into Dunn. This is a bad call. Yeah, you're right.
You don't have a right to block a runner's path. I know that much, but I can't really. I haven't.
Okay, so we went through those 6 clips, so let's kind of break that down a bit. And so in our clip 1, again, there was no contact on that play, and contact is not required if you, in our judgment as umpires, believe that the positioning of our defensive player, F3, altered the base running path of our batter runner. In clip 2, you would like to think that that's an obvious call. So in both of these situations, we would have a delayed dead ball. We're going to award a minimum of 1 base for our runners, and they're with the option of possibly awarding more in order to negate the obstruction call. In clips 3 and 4, here we have examples of a rundown situation where the defense obstructs in a possible rundown situation. And I know in clip 3, you know, I actually had a question as to whether or not I thought the runner had actually initiated that contact. And that's something that you might see. You know, there are times when a runner might try and buy an obstruction call, so you have to be kind of careful about that. And again, in these situations, it's a delayed dead ball, allow the play to continue, and then we'll award a minimum of 1 base and possibly more. In clips 5 and 6, clip 5 was the video from the World Series, I think 2013, where we had our play at third base. And for these kinds of plays, you know, there is a certain element of judgment involved. At some point in time, you know, there's contact. Okay, now that the initial contact is over, so when does that initial entanglement end and when does obstruction begin? So that's going to be a judgment call on our part, and we'll observe the play, observe the entirety of the play, and then make our call. And then the last clip that you saw on clip 6, we have multiple fielders who are attempting to field the ball, and we have contact with our batter runner. So what do we do here? We have F1, F3. We have our batter runner who's trying to advance to first base. There's our ball coming down. So as umpires, you know, there are a lot of things that we're going to have to umpire on this play. You know, the fair foul call that we have to make. We're going to have to make a decision as to which fielder is protected. Was there a catch? Was there obstruction? Was there interference? Was there a running lane violation? You know, there's a lot going on in this play. In the video, what they called was that the ball was caught by F3, so he's the one who's going to be protected. And as a result, if F3 is protected, F1 is not, because he didn't field the ball. The batter runner actually collided with F1, who was not protected, so the umpire ruled that F1 had obstructed and awarded the batter runner first base. Challenging play. So I'll stop it there, and I'll turn it over to Tim and Norm for any comments or questions before we continue on.
Okay, again, there are no questions. It must be the result of your excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to obstruction by a fielder, but this is now going to be the catcher on a runner at the plate. So again, here's our obstruction. We don't care whether it's intentional or unintentional by the fielder, but in this particular case, we're going to talk about the catcher. And again, the ball is going to be a delayed dead ball, allow playing action to end, and then we're going to determine which bases or base is going to be awarded as a result of the obstruction. And again, this is a situation where the catcher is not in possession of the ball, and he is denying access to home plate. So here we have a fairly good example, I'd like to think, where we have a catcher who is blocking the runner's path to home plate. And as you can see, he is not in possession of the baseball. So this is a good obstruction call. The one thing I do want to point out is in the act of fielding is not possession. Now, I do know at the collegiate level they went back and forth on that, but at the high school level, it was always in possession. So even in the act of fielding, that doesn't count. The catcher has to be in possession of the ball if he's going to block the plate. There are times where you might have multiple players who are there. So just like we had in our batter-runner scenario, advancing to first base, you're going to have to decide which player is going to be protected and which player is not. And if the player who is not protected, in this particular case, you might say it's the catcher, he's blocking the plate, and the runner can't gain access, so you might have obstruction on a call like this. Here's a quick case play. So we have R1 advancing to score when F7 throws home. Our catcher is completely blocking the plate with his lower leg, in possession of the ball, while juggling and attempting to secure possession of the thrown ball, or before the ball has reached F2. So in ruling A, because he is in possession, which is what we just talked about, that's going to be legal. In B and C, it's going to be obstruction on the catcher because the catcher is not in possession of the ball. A juggle is not possession. Secure and firm possession, either with the hand or with the ball, or with the glove in the ball in the glove. And he's denying access to home plate. And prior to securely possessing the thrown ball. But in our second example here, if our catcher were in the position shown to the right, where he was allowing access to the plate, then all three of these would actually be legal. So here are a couple clips that we're going to go through. You already saw clip 1. Clip 2, again, the catcher is not in possession. Clip 3, the catcher is not in possession. Clip 4, the catcher is not in possession, but he's giving access to the plate. And clip 5, he is not in possession and he's denying access to the base. So let's go ahead and take a look at that and run through these.
The whole Culberson around the bag and the one hopper from Schwarber. Look at the Ferris, and Schwarber has a chance to be taken away because of the silliest of rules.
the runner and then tag the runner. If any of these occur by rule, this would constitute obstruction. So let's take another look at this play here. We now know that the catcher can be in the act of fielding, and while doing so, he can go where he needs to be able to receive this throw. But as you watch this play here, just before he receives the ball, he takes his left foot and moves it another foot or two.
Okay. Those were some pretty good videos. So in clips 1, 2, 3, and 5, obviously our catcher is not in possession of the ball and is clearly blocking the base path for our runner trying to attempt to score. Now, this type of play is one of the hardest plays to call, to officiate, because of a number of different reasons. One is it's a bang-bang play. It can easily explode on you. There's a collision, generally, usually, normally, most of the time, possibly a violent collision, and possibly at times malicious contact, in which case you might actually have multiple calls to make. The catcher may be in his initial position, but then there are times when the catcher may move up the line in order to retrieve the thrown ball. And then for us as umpires, we certainly want to be in a good position, hopefully our wedge position, to make a good call on this type of play. But again, in all of our examples, the catcher must have possession to legally block the plate. And the catcher must give some access to the plate while not in possession, which they are not doing here. If the catcher moves into the runner's base path to field the ball, it is still going to be obstruction if the catcher does not have possession of the ball. So even though he may have moved and reestablished, that really shouldn't matter. What really matters to us as umpires is that the catcher needs to have possession if he's going to block the base path. Clip 4 should be fairly obvious and fairly easy for us to call. Look, this is a very good example where the catcher is in a position to receive the ball, but he's clearly giving access to the plate for our runner. So in this particular case, unless he does something different, and in the video he did not, this is a legal positioning and play by our F2 catcher. There are times when we might have obstruction and there's a play away from the obstruction. So here's a case play. There are no outs. We have runners on first and second. B4 hits a ground ball directly to F1. F6 holds R2, preventing him from advancing to third base. F1, who throws to F5 for the force out on R2 at third, but then F5 throws to F3 in time to put out B4. And why do we allow that to happen? Because obstruction is a delayed dead ball situation. So we're going to allow all playing action to be completed before we make our ruling. So in this particular situation, we're going to call obstruction when we see it. Call time after all playing action has ended. R2, because he was obstructed, is going to be awarded third. But because we allowed the play to continue, the action at first base was not affected by the obstruction call on R2. So we're going to allow that out on B4 to stand. And B5 will come to bat with 2 outs, R2 on third and R1 on second. We talked about malicious contact. The only point I want to make here is it supersedes any obstruction call. So if you see malicious contact that is created by a defender who also initiates malicious contact in addition to obstruction, then we're going to rule on the malicious contact because that will take precedence. What I thought I would do, and let me check my time here to see, I think we have some time. I'm going to take a quick timeout because we just talked about plays at the plate, and I mentioned the wedge play. So I wanted to go ahead and just put this diagram up, which kind of gives you a reference as to the play itself. We have our first and third base lines that are extended. Sometimes our umpires will either be at any one of those extensions or even at the point of the plate. But we also have these wedge positions which allow us to be in another position that may not be too far from either of these extensions, where it gives us a really good look at the critical component of the play at the plate, where we have the tag by the catcher on our runner and where we need to be in our wedge position to get the best view of that play. So let's go ahead and take a look at just 2 quick clips, which are great examples of the wedge play.
Got it. Crawford goes. His throw is on the money, and Mike, a lot of times umpires are just going to make that call because the ball beat him.
Reddick's throw to the plate. Save. He got a hit.
So hopefully you enjoyed those little quick mini mechanics, but the one thing I wanted, multiple things to take away, but the one of the things I'd like to mention is if you notice that our umpire was not stationary, he was in his good wedge position. The wedge may move, it may change, and he's taking quiet steps to change with it. So, and the other point is he's fairly close to the play. On force outs, you know, we can give ourselves some distance, but for tag plays, we want to be a little bit closer. So hopefully you'll take something away from that set of short videos. Okay, I'll stop there before we move into our final segment on catcher's interference and see if Norm, Tim have any comments and questions, and then we'll move into our last segment.
Okay, Greg, we had a couple questions on the previous set of videos. And before I go into the questions, let me explain why we group the clips together as a single video with 4 or 5 different plays. That's a technical limitation of the GoToMeeting system. So that's the best way to present those videos to you without choppiness. So there were 3 questions all about the play, the pop-up along the first baseline that was caught by the first baseman. And the questions asked, let me get to it, I'm on the wrong one. Why isn't the fly ball along the first base still an out? The ball was caught before the obstruction, close, but before. So why don't we call the fly ball an out? That's a good question. As I looked at that video, the protected fielder was the first baseman, and he caught the ball. So since he was protected and caught the ball, it seems to me like we should have an out. The fact that the pitcher obstructed the runner didn't really have any effect on the ball being caught by the first baseman. So
let's see, Norm, let me stop you there because that's my fault. That was a chopper, so that was not a fly ball.
Oh.
So it was coming down, but
okay.
It had hit the ground first. So my bad.
That makes a big difference. Okay, if it had been a fly ball, we would have the out. First baseman catching a pop-up, that would have an out. The chopper, essentially that's a ground ball. So in that case, the pitcher obstructing the runner denied him the opportunity to swerve past the first baseman who's fielding the chopper and obtain first base. There was one other question about, and it may just be that Greg misspoke, but the question was, a fielder protected on a play at the plate, question mark. I thought protection was only for a fielder who's fielding a batted ball. And that's correct. If a fielder is protected when they're fielding a batted ball. So if there was a misspoken statement, the catcher is not protected at the plate. I mean, if he's obstructing, he's obstructing. The only protection he has is once he catches the ball, the runner can't maliciously contact him. I think I have answered them.
Okay, thank you, Norm. And if I misspoke, I apologize. But that's a pretty good subtlety between protecting a fielder on a batted ball versus a thrown ball to the plate to the catcher. Yeah,
right.
Good call. Yep. Okay, so in our next segment, in our last segment for tonight, we're going to talk about catcher's interference, and that's going to be on the obstruction on the batter. Quick flashback, we talked about backswing interference, we talked about follow-through interference. Those are penalties by the batter. Violation by the catcher is catcher's interference. So here's our backswing. If you recall, this is all pre-pitch. There's our follow-through. The pitch came in, the batter missed it and made contact with the catcher. Again, these are things that are against our batter. We're now talking about catcher's interference, where the catcher is interfering with the batter's actual swing. Interference on the actual swing, regardless if the ball is fair or foul, because at the time of the catcher's interference, you don't know whether that could have caused a foul ball to go fair or a fair ball to go foul. It's going to be a delayed dead ball situation, with the exception of, for whatever reason, the pitcher, while not engaged with the pitching plate, makes a throw to the catcher. That's a separate issue. We're going to call time as soon as any runner or batter runner has not advanced a minimum of one base. So again, it's a delayed dead ball. We're going to allow the play to continue. And in catcher's interference, the coach, this is one of three scenarios where the coach has the choice to accept the penalty or accept the play. And he only gets a choice if the batter runner and all runners do not advance a minimum of one base. And we talked about that sunset clause. It must be made before the next pitch, award, or whether the fielders leave the field. Again, it's ignored if the batter runner reaches first base and all runners advance one base. And the other component to this particular type of violation, any runner attempting to advance, steal, like a squeeze play on catcher's interference, the batter shall be awarded the base he is attempting. If not attempting, the runner shall be awarded the next base. Catcher's interference is enforced. All runners, if not forced, shall return to the base occupied at the time of pitch. So if we have a runner on second and he's not stealing third, and we have catcher's interference, we're going to award the batter the batter first base. But because first base is empty, we only have R2. R2 will be returned to second base. So here are a couple scenarios that we might see for catcher's interference. When there are no runners on, okay, versus when there are runners on base. So with no runners on, it's going to be a little bit cleaner. Batter runner does not advance to first base safely, so we're just going to award the batter runner first base. If the batter runner gets a hit and advances to first, we're going to ignore the catcher's interference. And if the batter will advance beyond first, the batter is going to advance beyond the protected base. So we have catcher's interference and we think it was only a single and he tries to stretch a single into a double. We potentially have the out at second. Conversely, if we believe it was a double and he's called out at second, then we'll protect him to second base. It gets a little bit more complicated when we have base runners on base. So if we have a base hit and not every runner advances one base, we now have the coach's choice. Runners advance if forced. If a runner is stealing, he gets the base. If a runner is not stealing, then we're not going to award him the base beyond the base that he is at. If we have a base hit and all runners advance one base, just like in the other scenario, we're going to ignore catcher's interference. Batter runners at risk beyond the base in which we, the umpires, will protect them to. So it's cleaner if we don't have any runners on, but that may not always be the case. So we need to be prepared to officiate this play when we have runners on base. Sometimes it's difficult to see catcher's interference. We've got a couple of videos where it's obvious, but there are times when it's difficult to see. One of the other indicators that you might want to use is sound, because when you hear the back of the glove being struck at by a baseball bat, it's going to give you a nice thud sound. Not always, but there are times when it might. So use other senses like sound as an input when making this call. So let's go ahead and take a look at our final set of videos on catcher's interference.
No at bat for Shane Peterson. He reaches for it, knocks the glove right off his hand, and well, you don't hardly ever see that with a left-handed hitter up.
That's just a late swing, an emergency swing to foul a pitch off, and
that one hit him apparently.
Well, he's got the most in baseball. It does. He's got a longer swing, and on a breaking ball, he just catches the top of the glove. I believe fastball. That's strike two. Time out! And now they're going to say that catcher's interference. Let's see. You could hear it. Yep, just ticked the webbing of the glove. And that catcher's interference.
Bounce towards second. Shuffle towards second, and they're going to call it.
Watch. Flowers puts his glove up, and Reddick kind of waits and is delayed in the swing. It's not like he goes after it, and Reddick.
Okay, so in a number of our clips, we have catcher's interference where it's obvious, it's not as obvious. Again, it's going to be a delayed dead ball. We're going to enforce catcher's interference if the batter and all runners do not advance one base. If it's enforced, the interference, coach has the option to take the penalty or the result of the play. Again, that's one of three opportunities in which coach gets a choice. The other two are illegal player and illegal equipment are the other two coach's choice options. It's, again, the coach's responsibility to recognize that he has a choice. We're not to bring it to their attention. And again, if the batter runner and all runners advance, then we're going to ignore catcher's interference. And again, another component to this is that if there are runners who are stealing and we have catcher's interference, the runner is going to get the base in which he's attempting to advance to. One of the things that hopefully you saw in the videos as well is we have a pretty strong and pretty demonstrative mechanic by our umpires. We're pointing to the catcher, the violator, and we're announcing that we have catcher's interference. We may give a signal with our hands, like touching the back end of a catcher's glove, but it's a come up strong, be demonstrative, particularly on those that are more subtle calls, the ones where the catcher's mitt is on the ground. That's going to be an easy sell, but for others which are fairly subtle, and the coaches and the fans may not hear that little tick that you hear or hear that thud that you hear. So that's why it's good to come up with the demonstrative signal and the pointing to allow everyone to know that you're making a catcher's interference call. Last case play, R1 is on second, F2 obstructs B3. As he reaches first base safely, R1, who was not moving on the pitch, is thrown out at the plate. Obstruction is ignored because R1 had advanced one base and B3 had reached first base. So any advancement by R1 to home plate is at his own risk. So important differentiation. Because of time, I'm not going to go through this next one because we're a little bit over. I'll go ahead and show it so that we record it. And if you're interested, you can watch the recording and take a look at this case play. There's another case play. We'll have to skip it due to time constraints. And with that, that's it for tonight's presentation. So we talked about obstruction, blocking the plate. We talked about obstruction, where our fielders are impeding or altering or hindering our base runners. We talked about obstruction of the catcher, plays at the plate, and not having possession of the ball. And then we talked about catcher's interference. So I know that's a lot. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to either call Norm, Tim, or myself. You're more than welcome to email us for any additional questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim and Norm to see if we have any questions or comments before we move to our next scheduled chart.
Okay, thanks. Did you have something to say, Norm?
Well, there was two quick things. A comment: what you might think, why on earth would the coach decide to take the results of a play if you have catcher's interference and a guy hits a fly ball to right field that is caught? Well, you might have had a runner on third who tags up and scores, and the coach decides he wants the run. If he wants the run, the out stands. There was another comment, it may be that, Greg, that you misspoke about having catcher's interference where you protect a runner to second base. And I don't think that's correct. I think if you have catcher's interference, if he gets a base, if he tries to go further than a base, he's at his own risk. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Nope, you're right. My bad.
Okay, that's it for questions.
All right, guys. Appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. Thanks, Greg. It was an excellent presentation as usual. We didn't have a lot of attendees tonight, but those of you who are on, I think you know that a lot of the scrimmage schedule is out. Everything on my schedule says people have accepted. So get your gear out, get it ready, because we're going to hit the ground running starting about the 29th of this month. And I think the pace is going to pick up if the rain abates this year. So good luck to everybody, and we'll talk to you at the next webinar.
Thank you, Tim. And here's our remaining schedule. So we're going to meet again on the 17th, a week from tonight. There's our subjects, base awards, timing plays, force plays. And again, as you can see, the highlight, some changes on March 1st, which is a Sunday night. That will be our review number 8. And then, as we indicated earlier, on the 16th, our last review, we're going to come back, circle around, and talk more about the DH changes for this year. So with that, I'll ask everyone to go ahead and sign off, and I'll so that Norm, Tim, Jerry, and I can do a wrap up. And thank you for attending. I apologize for the technical delays, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Okay, not too bad. I apologize.